if you talk to counterintelligence folks today, there is a sense that they feel sometimes that folks in the Valley don't understand the national security implications of the work that they do, because they're just existing in a place where they want to sell. They want to get bought out or sell, and they don't. There's a certain cosmopolitanism here, which can be really, really good and beneficial and open and wonderful and a symbol of like what's best about America. But there's also this side where there's a sense in which it's untethered from the kind of exigent national security concerns of the day and interstate competition. And so Harper, I think, provides a great example of like a worst case scenario for how that culture can go really, really sour.
I'm Scott R. Anderson, and this is the Lawfare podcast for August 23rd, 2023. In May 1984, former U.S. Marine, engineer, and early Silicon Valley entrepreneur James Harper was sentenced to life in prison for his central role in an audacious scheme to sell a bevy of classified documents relating to U.S. missile defense to the Soviet bloc and its allies. 4 decades later, his story was almost forgotten, until it was rediscovered and investigated by national security reporter Zach Dorfman with help from some of the men who helped catch Harper and the spy himself. Now, with help from our friends at Goat Rodeo, Dorfman has turned this story into a phenomenal 6-part podcast series entitled Spy Valley, which takes a close look at Harper's seminal spy case. Earlier this week, I sat down with Dorfman to talk over Harper's story and what it can tell us about the relationship between America's national security and those working at the bleeding edge of technological development. And after our conversation, be sure to stay tuned for a preview from Spy Valley, which is available now on your favorite podcatcher. It's the Lawfare podcast for August 23rd. Zach Dorfman on Spy Valley, an engineer's nuclear betrayal. So, Zach, you have put together a really pretty amazing story here. It's a story that big elements of, at least the broad strokes of, were known to the public, have been known to the public. I think people who are really deeply immersed in spy literature and spy history may be familiar with this case, or nuclear history for that matter, but has really kind of fallen out of the public memory. I think memory hold, as you described it, in discussing this project in a related audio recording. Tell us how you found this story, this individual, James Harper, that is the center of this narrative, and what made you drawn to it as such a compelling story to warrant this treatment that you've given over these 6 episodes.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on Lawfare, Scott. As far as the genesis of this story, I was having a conversation with an FBI contact of mine named Bill Kinane, and Bill, who passed recently, but is a big part of the podcast, was a longtime FBI counterintelligence agent in San Francisco. He spent the vast majority of his career there, and he worked Russian counterintelligence, but then also what was known as East Bloc counterintelligence, which was all of the Soviet Union's allies from the Warsaw Pact, from Eastern Europe. And I was having coffee outside one day with Bill at a cafe north of San Francisco in Marin County. And Bill kind of offhand said, somebody really needs to do something on the Harper story. That was such a big story, and I don't think Bill was just trying to push something that he had worked on. I mean, Bill was the FBI squad leader. He was the head leader of the squad that was devoted to the East Bloc at the time. And so he knew a great deal about it. But Bill also really understood what a great story was. He was a natural born storyteller. And he knew that this case was an important one, and that, like you said, had been kind of like memory hold. And then I thought about it. I asked Bill about his recollections, and although a lot of it was public, the story was coast to coast headlines. There was a lot of really great granular detail and stuff that had never made it into the public sphere. And so I spoke to Bill about it, and then I talked to an editor of mine at the time, and Sharon Weinberger, now at the Wall Street Journal, and I asked Sharon, well, I think I found this spy. I think I found this guy, James Harper, this guy who had been a spy for the Eastern Bloc. I think he's out of prison. I think he's alive. I think he's living in Arkansas. How do you recommend that I get in touch with him? And she said, I really recommend you do the soft touch, and that you write him a letter. Don't call him. You're going to scare him off. Don't doorstep him. You're going to scare him off. Write him a letter, like a formal letter. Tell him who you are, why you wanted to hear about his story, and see if he responds. And I thought this was like a 1 in a million chance that he would ever respond to me, because Most folks, you spend 30 plus years in federal prison, spying, you want to leave that part of your life behind. Reporters are a nosy bunch. A lot of people are not particularly pleased to interact with us. So I was very, very surprised and obviously thrilled when not too long after I wrote that letter, I got a voicemail from an unknown number, and I could not believe it. But it was James Harper in Arkansas calling me back, and he seemed amenable to talking. And then we started talking quite a bit. And so he told me his story from his perspective, which I think hopefully is an important and unique part of this, which is hearing about spying an American turncoat in that person's own words.
So you mentioned from the outset that this is an important story, even though it has kind of fallen out of the public memory, or had at least before this podcast, and that the people who worked on the case matter, this FBI contact of yours, other people throughout the podcast as well, see it as an important case. People who have exposure to a broad swath of sort of conduct in the space, nonetheless, this one stands out. Tell us what makes it important, why it is kind of an exceptional story in this universe, and what again makes it stand out in the memory to warrant the exceptional effort you've put behind in contacting Harper and pulling together so much information behind it. Why does it stand out among other spy stories?
Well, I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is the kind of persistence of the US-Russia nuclear competition and spy games. And that's something that it was memory hold for a while, because there was this post-Cold War moment where there was this sense, at least in the public sphere, that this was no longer a priority. I mean, even 5 years ago, with the rise of China and national security and in the intelligence reporting space, China became the kind of primary focus. China is kind of seen as the near peer competitor, all that stuff. But Russia never went away. I mean, Russia experts all were saying that till they were blue in the face, although I think they felt like they were kind of in the wilderness and people weren't listening to them. And then, of course, what happened was the Russian invasion, or the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the very real, very serious nuclear saber rattling by Russian President Vladimir Putin. And so, the Harper story took place at a time in the late 70s and early 80s when the Cold War had reached its kind of second apex, and you had real acute fears of nuclear confrontation. I don't think we're quite at that point again today, but I do think there is a sense that there's this very sophisticated calibration that's going on about, well, what are these red lines? What can we do in our assistance to Ukraine? What can't we do? Might Putin, if he feels backed into a corner, assent to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, which is I don't even like that phrase very much, because you're talking about a nuclear weapon that's more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that makes it sound like it's just like a slightly bigger bomb, which it's not, conventional warfare. So there's the nuclear dimension, and just this sense that these spy games never went away, and this is a great window into a period when you had similar, very significant nuclear-related tensions, and a sense of the lengths which both sides were willing to go to find each other's agents, recruit each other's agents, steal information about nuclear weapons programs. And I should just say that, Harper was primarily dealing with the Poles, but the Poles were acting as a 100% proxy for the KGB, the Soviet KGB. The money was coming from Moscow. The direction was coming from Moscow. When the Poles got the documents, the Russians flew in a team of KGB officers overnight. I mean, this was a huge deal for the KGB. So that's one part of it. The other thing that I think is really important is just the persistence of a certain culture in Silicon Valley. This is a story about US-Russia relations, about nuclear danger, but it's also a story about a kind of culture of avarice in the Valley that goes back many, many decades. And there's lots of examples of it more contemporaneously. But you can see in Harper, I mean, this guy literally invented the digital stopwatch, right? He was present at the creation of the Valley. I mean, he was working in the Valley from the late 50s to the early 60s when around the time that the first silicon-based microchips were appearing, when Silicon Valley became Silicon Valley. And you get this sense from him of this entrepreneur who almost made it big, but could never quite get there. and almost viewed spying as just another play, just another move. So my digital stopwatch didn't, play didn't work. My magnetics company didn't work. Working for this storied Silicon Valley firm, Fairchild, didn't work. Well, I have another opportunity. I have a competitive advantage here. I can now just sell secrets to the Soviet bloc. And that's the way he looked at it. And I think, if you talk to counterintelligence folks today, there is a sense that they feel sometimes that folks in the Valley don't understand the national security implications of the work that they do, because they just existing in a place where they want to sell. They want to get bought out or sell, and they don't. There's a certain cosmopolitanism here, which can be really, really good and beneficial and open and wonderful and a symbol of like what's best about America. But there's also this side where there's a sense in which it's untethered from the kind of exigent national security concerns of the day and interstate competition. And so Harper, I think, provides a great example of like a worst case scenario for how that culture can go really, really sour. So those are the two main things I would say are particularly relevant for today.
So I want to dig into each of those a little further. But before we get there, I think we have to talk about the guy at the middle of the story, James Harper, whose biography is the thread of the podcast and is the main line of the story, but if not necessarily the entire thing. Tell us a little bit about who this guy is. Where did he come from? And what led a man who had early success, as you noted, in being an inventor, an engineer with very marketable job skills, I think by most assessments in his repertoire, down this path towards doing something as dramatic as selling some of the most essential secrets of national security and national defense to a foreign enemy. What is this trajectory, and where does it start?
It's interesting. I mean, I'll give you the bare facts of the CV, but there's certain things that are almost a mystery to me to this day. I mean, other than pure greed, and it's hard for me to imagine being so greedy that you'd be willing to step over the lines that he stepped. But just as a quick summary of who James Harper was and where he came from. So James Harper is actually a child of California. He grew up on the outskirts of the Bay Area. And he's one of three boys. He was the middle child, and his entire family were science and technology geniuses. I mean, they really were. I mean, he came from a family of people who just had a facility for engineering. And he went to high school in the Bay Area. He thought he was going to be drafted in the Korean War, and he ended up just missing it, but he volunteered for service, which gave him his education in his formal education in engineering. So the U.S. military gave him the skill set that he later used for the rest of his life. And also, by the way, the military trained him. His military training him allowed him to understand what was valuable and what wasn't in the documents that he was passing on to the Soviet bloc. So there's another one there, another irony there. So he graduated, he did his military service, and then he worked on missiles in the burgeoning, early 1950s Southern California military industrial complex, which, was very important, kind of separate from the Valley, but still important to this day. There's a lot of kind of missile development, aerospace technology stuff going on down there. Comes back to the Valley, has a incredible little adventure that we couldn't put in the podcast, where he works on nuclear warning defense systems in Alaska. It's called the White Alice Project. So he goes to Alaska and he helps the Air Force set up communication relay stations in case there's ballistic missiles from Russia. And he worked at a facility that was so close. It was called Tin City. It was so close to the Russian mainland that on a clear day, you actually could see Siberia from there. Like, the famous Sarah Palin thing, like he actually could see Russia from Alaska.
Amazing.
Like, yeah, he comes back to the Valley. He founds his own firm that kind of burns out. He ends up working for a company called Fairchild, which, as I mentioned before, was this foundational Valley firm that produced, they call them Fair Children because there were so many of them that went on to found important companies, including companies like Intel. So we're talking about, and he's a little bit behind those folks, but we're talking about somebody who really he was there when people started making a great deal of money, right? Like fortunes are being made. There's a sense of this like boundless future, and it's happening here. And he's a native son of this place at precisely the moment when it's exploding. And you're literally talking about a region that went from like fruit tree farms to high-tech business parks, right? Like while he is there. Then he founds his digital stopwatch company. He gets kicked out of the stopwatch company for embezzlement. The investors say that he is stealing money. This company still exists today, by the way. It's called AccuSplit. And I think on tape, I think it made it into the podcast, he kind of says, yeah, they still use my name, you know, like they took my AccuSplit name, you know, never mentioned to me that he was kicked out for embezzlement though. And he has a wife and he has a family, he has 4 daughters, but Harper was a cheater. He drank very heavily. He was a heavy gambler. Couldn't get into that in the series either. He used to gamble. He told me, I don't know if this is true or not. He told me he used to play Yahtzee with Wilt Chamberlain, the one of the greatest basketball players of all time. When Chamberlain was played for the Warriors, and he eventually meets a woman who was a girlfriend of his. They have 2 separate flings that are separated by years, but this woman's name is Ruby Louise Schuler. And Schuler works for a defense contractor that works on ballistic missile defense related to intercontinental ballistic missiles and Minuteman missiles, which are part of America's nuclear triad. And he realizes, oh, wow, my girlfriend, this is not a thought that I think any of us would have, my girlfriend, my partner works for a firm that does incredibly sensitive nuclear ballistic missile research. I should really sell that to America's enemies. That's a good way for me to make some cash. And that was literally how he phrased it to me. I mean, well, I think he said, she's really sitting in the middle of a berry patch for me. This is a great way for me to make some extra cash on the side. Or honestly, not cash on the side. He thought he was going to get rich. He thought this was going to be his true payday. I mean, he wanted $1 million in 1979, which is over $4 million today. So he wanted to make big money. One thing I should also add is that even before he did the nuclear espionage, he was involved in a kind of ring of folks who were selling export prohibited technology to the Eastern Bloc. There was a lot of economic libertarianism in the Valley then, as there is today. And there were folks who thought that export prohibitions on high tech to American adversaries were stupid and anti-capitalist, and that they should be able to trade with whomever they wanted. And so Harper kind of helped in a small way in helping like electronic parts and computer pieces get to Poland and the Eastern Bloc. So he kind of like stepped his toe in spine. I mean, like really like a little bit. And then by 79, so he just dove in, not even looking where he was going.
So he's such an interesting figure. So from my kind of reading into espionage stuff, there's kind of a famous acronym people talk about the motivation behind spies. It's MICE, right? So it's money, ideology, compromise, which basically means you're being blackmailed or something. They were just looking for a C word that I think worked because that one's not that great. And then ego, right? What are the motivations that drove him through this line of behavior? Because the money certainly is a part of it, right? But there's also this kind of strange gamesmanship and a little bit that does seem to have a synergy with the entrepreneurial spirit, with some of the Silicon Valley ethos that to me strikes me as a little bit of that ego line, that it's not just getting money, but it's getting money by being better than other people, outwitting other people. Because we see him play these games against people, whether it's his handlers with the Polish intelligence service, whether it's his wife who he's cheating on, whether it's his girlfriends who he's kind of playing off each other in various ways. Does that ring a bell with you? And I guess, how does that carry through with how he looks back at these sorts of developments, at the things that he did?
No, I think that's 100% right. Well, let's start with what it isn't. It's not compromise. I mean, he was not compromised. I mean, he certainly he had financial troubles, but he was not compromised by a spy service, by the Poles or the KGB or anybody. Ideology, no. I mean, in early Cold War, you did have like the Rosenbergs and particularly through the into the 50s, you had American spies who spied for Moscow because they were actual true believers who were communists or fellow travelers who believed in trying to assist, in building the kind of glorious socialist future. By the 80s, that was all out the window. The propaganda over communism being a true form of democracy, nobody believed it anymore. There was, you had Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin. Nobody was really spying for the Eastern Bloc anymore or the USSR because they loved communism, especially in its Soviet manifestation. If James Harper had an ideology, it was the ideology of Gordon Gekko in Wall Street. Greed is good. And so in that way, he is paradigmatically American, or at least in a certain kind of curdled understanding or vision of American capitalism that exists in some corners of American society and culture. But I don't think he didn't spy because he was like, I'm John Galt. I need to, I'm like the Ubermensch who needs to go out there and show everybody what true capitalism is. I think he, first and foremost, was just a very greedy person. But I do think that it is impossible to separate his story from ego, the E in mice, because my experience with him and his actions as relayed by others and the way he told me his own story makes it clear that he always thought that he was the smartest guy in the room and the rules didn't apply. And it's funny because you think about this as a Silicon Valley archetype, right? Where, they used to have this thing what was the old phrase of Facebook was like move fast and break stuff, fake it till you make it. You think about Elizabeth Holmes, you think about people who like literally were just like, we don't have this thing, but we will have it. And we can defraud our investors until we actually have the thing that we say we have now. There's a culture here about, well, we just keep, it's like you bend and bend and bend and bend and bend the rules until eventually you've just broken them out, right? And again, I think Harper is an extreme example of that. I don't think just because you're a fraud or, just because you've committed bank or wire fraud or defrauded your investors doesn't mean you're a spy. Far from it. But there is a certain lax view of aspects of criminality in the Valley in the service of your greater project that I think Harper represents well. His greater project was only himself at a certain point. He wasn't trying to raise money. It was like he was trying to spy to raise money for his startup, although that would have been a very interesting wrinkle, right? He already given up on that. The digital stopwatch thing was in the rear view for him, and he was already in his middle age. And I think he just felt like this was his best play. But that's my sense of what motivated Harper. Just and also in a way, you got a sense with him where he almost viewed it as like a challenging game. Yeah. Like you said, like he was playing everyone off each other and he thought he could just outfox everybody else and it would just be like a great grand adventure, to be a spy. And in a way that's not entirely shocking because on the flip side of it, some people become intelligence officers for the same reason, right? I mean, intelligence officers go to different countries and break laws there, right? In the service of their own country, but they are like working within in a legal gray space abroad. And you have to have that certain drive to do something that is dangerous and a little bit outside the norm. There's the old saying about like the FBI catches bank robbers and the CIA robs banks. CIA doesn't rob banks. CIA people listening, I know you don't rob banks, but like it's just reflective of a certain mindset where like certain people just are more comfortable in kind of ethical or moral ambiguity. And Harper took that to something that was beyond ambiguity. But in his own mind, because I think he evinces certain kinds of like sociopathic behavioral traits. In his own mind, it was, in his own mind, it seemed like he just was working in an ambiguous, I mean, I think he was afraid of getting caught. I think he didn't want to go to jail, but I never for a second got a sense that he believed what he did was wrong in any way, which I guess in hindsight is even more shocking.
Yeah, it's just such a fascinating personality to see emerging in your one-on-one conversations that form such a bulk of the actual audio content, hearing from him in his first voice, how he's describing a lot of these actions. And then The other part that's amazing that fits in here is the culture or context in which he's operating, which facilitates all this. Because as you noted, he comes in and he's actually initially connected to the possibility of selling secrets to the Soviet bloc, or to the Eastern Bloc, I should say, because there's already another ring doing something sort of similar with another prominent entrepreneur slash former congressional candidate slash a million other things, Mr. Hugel, who plays a role in this earlier. And then, of course, he has his girlfriends, the main girlfriend who, Louise Schuler, who becomes his wife later, who serves as the contact to get the actual document that he's marketing. He has another girlfriend he uses as a cutout to contact the Poles. There are other women who are involved that he's involved with in different environments. He has another friend who helps him stash a bunch of these documents, to whom he openly acknowledges these are classified documents. Can you help me hide them with your boat? And this guy appears to do it. It's so interesting that this guy was in this context where he could easily find people and had already found people willing to help him in these sorts of ventures. What is it that put him in that context? Do you have a sense of how it is he found himself in the company of so many people willing to go into an enterprise that to a lot of Americans, particularly at that moment, would have seemed pretty horrific? I think it's just really amazing to me.
That's a great question, man. I do not know. I could not find a single person on my life who would be like, "Oh yeah, cool, yeah. Oh, you want me to become an accessory after the fact to nuclear espionage? Cool, yeah. That sounds good. That sounds good. Oh, you need me to introduce you to the Soviet bloc intelligence officer I know to sell those documents. Not only am I going to do that, but I better get my cut, right? I better get my cut. Like, so that's Hugel. I don't know. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. I think culturally he was already primed, like you said. I mean, just to step back on. So for listeners who haven't heard any of the episodes yet, I mean, the guy who introduced Harper to the intelligence officer that he then, was his main point of contact, in the Eastern Bloc, was a semiconductor pioneer in the Bay Area named Bill Hugel. And Bill Hugel, man, you could do a whole nother podcast or book on Bill Hugel if you could, because he's just Bill Hugel, like I said, semiconductor pioneer. His first wife, Frances Sarnat Hugel, was actually like a genius who died tragically in, I think, her early 40s. But Hugel, speaking of archetypes, I mean, Hugel, he ran for Congress, as you said, as a Democrat in the Democratic primary. He lost, but he was endorsed by major figures in the Democratic Party in the early 1970s, like senators and governors. And this is 1972. So he ran for Congress as a Democrat in 1972 on a pro-pot libertarian, right? Pro-pot legalization, anti-war, pro-free trade with the Eastern Bloc. Right. He was like a pure, like a real Silicon Valley archetype there. Right. 1972. This is the year he runs for Congress as Democrat. It is also the same year in the Polish intelligence archives that identifies Hugel as an agent of the Polish intelligence services. So this guy was running for Congress and came close. I mean, he would have won if he had won the primary, right? He would have won that seat in the Valley. So you have an interesting side story there of a guy who was very mixed up in, basically being an agent of a foreign intelligence service while also running for Congress. And there are, I think, some good echoes of today there and some concerns we have about foreign influence on our elections today. By 75, Hugel was like up to his neck in, he was the main guy. He was like, Harper was a bit player. Hugel was like literally, he was known as like the big man, right? Like he was the guy who was leading the efforts throughout the Valley to get prohibited technology to the Eastern Bloc, to sell it to them. And Harper was just one of his minions, and the FBI from 1975 on, at least, knew that this guy was dirty, but just couldn't nail him. They just couldn't nail him for whatever reason. Because he had all these he was also connected too, right? That's what made it like complicated. Like he had friends in high places. He was active in Democratic Party politics. He was a consultant. I don't think it's gone to the podcast, but he was a consultant for the British government in the mid to late 70s. He served in the late 1970s. He served as he served as a back channel in the Iranian hostages crisis in 79 through his daughter, because his daughter was married to an Iranian man who was connected to the Iranian regime or knew people. So like he was like a mover and shaker. He was operating at a higher level. Harper was just a lot more rough around the edges. And so, like, how Harper met a guy like Bill Hugel and fell in with Bill Hugel and just happened to know a group of like people in the Valley who were more than willing to sell secrets to the Eastern Bloc. I mean, as far as I understand it, they literally all just drank at the same bars. They literally just would go, like in the Valley at the time, there was like 2 bars where all the founders and entrepreneurs and startup guys would go hang out and get drunk. And at some point, he met Bill Hugel at a bar and helped him out with some guys who were harassing his wife at the time, like kicked him out, like literally took him by the back of their neck and threw him out of the bar. And after that, Bill Hugel was like, "Oh, you could be useful to me." And that's how James Harper got involved, all these people who were already involved in this kind of like, definitely, is it spying? I don't know. It's definitely spying-ish. You're definitely engaging in activities that are very close to spying, in terms of like shipping prohibited technology. But he was already, by the time he started selling those nuclear documents, he was already very comfortable in this space. And he knew a lot of people who also seemed pretty comfortable with it.
So we know, and you've already drawn a lot of parallels between this case and today's efforts in Silicon Valley, right? The fact that we still have Silicon Valley playing this integral role in American national defense, because a big part of national defense is premised on cutting edge emerging technologies. That's no longer localized to Silicon Valley, but we still say Silicon Valley to mean the industries that pertains to, right? What is your sense of the takeaways, the lessons for this sort of story to this more contemporary experience? Where are the parallels, the big parallels between what happened in this pretty exceptional case and the risks that are kind of on the current terrain? How have we seen the government or Silicon Valley itself kind of adapt to address some of these problems, or have we not seen that happen? And are there still these big cultural, institutional blind spots that kind of allowed this story to develop the way it did in the 1970s and 1980s? Are they still around today?
Short answer is yes. Long answer is, oh my God, we could spend hours talking about that. So the Valley has changed a lot since those days, but there is still an immense amount of classified work that goes on in the Valley and stuff that is explicitly related to national defense. But you also have new kinds of threats from an intelligence perspective. I mean, not too long ago, there was a reported case of at least one undercover, I forget it was an agent or an actual intelligence officer, but there was a Saudi agent working at Twitter, right? And I think that's a really good example, because it shows that you're not just like, the value of spying in the Valley is no longer just about, stuff that goes into an airplane or a ballistic missile system. It's also about like the companies that I say we broadly, but really the entire world uses almost as like a predicate for modern existence. Like, it's very hard to imagine modern life without social media or digital payments. And because of that, there's inherent value to spy services to be able to understand those systems, compromise those systems, have technical or human penetrations of those companies. And that's all in the Valley. Then you also have the persistent problem of startups and folks within those companies not necessarily even understanding the potential military or intelligence uses of the technology that they're developing. So that is very much part of the spy scene in the Valley. And then you have this idea that I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, and I would hear this from FBI counterintelligence folks while reporting this story, and some earlier reporting that I've done for Politico and Foreign Policy and elsewhere on spying in the Valley, which is that, the goal of startups is to get bought. They don't necessarily care who's buying it, but they want somebody to buy it, and so that's all. Why steal technology if you could have a front company that just buys it and then you own it, right? If you're China or Russia, you don't need to steal it. You can literally just identify something in its nascent formative stages that you think this is going to be really important for the future of artificial intelligence or night vision technology or avionics. But the founders of that company, those 3 guys working in a garage or in a strip mall somewhere, like, they don't seem to understand, why this might be so valuable for intelligence or military agencies, and then you snatch it up. Or sometimes it's just as simple as literally presenting to potential investors. Like, that's all intelligence. Economic intelligence is a massive part of what countries collect in the Valley. And by the way, not just American adversaries. I mean, many American allies are engaged in the acquisition of economic intelligence in the Valley. So, in a way, the scene is much more difficult for folks in the counterintelligence space because it's not merely just, bombs and guns. It's now almost every facet of contemporary life, from social media to military defense and like everything in between. And I don't envy the task that the folks have on the counterintelligence side of like figuring out how to protect secrets. But the problem is these aren't all secrets, right? Again, like the Harper stuff was clear cut. These are classified documents. They relate to ballistic missiles. But how do you tell a small startup working on something that they don't think has any relationship whatsoever to military intelligence? Oh, this is sensitive technology. You should really think about who you're going to sell this to. It's completely outside of the federal classification system. And so there's way more soft targets in the Valley than probably anywhere else on Earth. And so it's kind of like a movable feast for foreign intelligence agencies. And I think it's going to be a problem for many, many decades for national security officials, because there's going to be inherent tensions between that entrepreneurial ethos and that openness ethos of the Valley and the ethos of the national security world, which is the opposite. It's closed. It's about restricting access, protecting America's unique capabilities from other states. And those two things are going to be in tension with one another in perpetuity.
So I don't want to jump ahead to the end of the story, but I think we have to talk a little bit about the context, right? Because we know, we at this point that we're recording, 5 of the 6 episodes are released. So I guess I don't know the full end of the story. I'm very much eagerly awaiting that last episode this week. But we do know the end of the story, of course, for Mr. Harper, because as you mentioned at the top of the series, at the top of this episode, he was in jail for several decades. He was caught. And he was caught substantially as a result of his own actions, not just in committing crimes, but in attempting to approach the U.S. government and seek some sort of deal that will get him out of the potential criminal liability of having done a lot of these things in a kind of surreptitious way that led investigators to him. It's interesting that this case is thought of by people who worked on it as a very seminal one. But at the same time, it seems like the counterintelligence breakthrough was actually a high degree of fortune. That's not unusual for counterintelligence stuff. Like, you kind of just wait for spies to slip up or do something arrogant or get overly confident. And that's what gives you the hook that lets you then chase down the rest of the story, at least from my, kind of secondhand experience with similar stories. But it's pretty exceptional here, right? Like, it got very lucky in a way that they were able to get so much information directly from Harper himself through this interlocutory, this lawyer he's working with to try and negotiate some sort of deal for him that lets them piece together, oh, this is probably the guy, and investigate it. And barring that, it seems harder to say for certain that he would have been held accountable, at least in the sort of time frame that he was kind of caught. Have we learned lessons about counterintelligence in these sorts of environments or the broader national security atmosphere? Have we seen the government adapt? Did your FBI contacts talk about the lessons of this case for them? And are there those lessons things that have been institutionalized to make these sorts of cases harder today? Or are they really still a lot of vulnerabilities that this case brings to light that are still ever present in this sort of context?
So there's a lot of important questions there. I think, so just to take it back a few steps. I mean, for folks who haven't heard the podcast yet. So Harper did decide at a certain point that he was going to try to become a double agent. When he realized that he was like in over his head, he anonymously tried to get the CIA to run him as a double agent. And of course they very quietly like laughed him out of the room, metaphorically, but they wanted to keep him talking and to give more information to give himself up. That was one part of it. That's unusual. You're right about that. I mean, he implicated himself horribly in that way. But there was another aspect to this, which was that the U.S. intelligence community had a mole within the Polish intelligence services, right? So there's this saying that it takes a spy to catch a spy. And that truth is kind of is crystallized here to an extent, where the way that the FBI was able to catch Harper was to marry up the information that they had from the US's own, CIA's own source within Polish intelligence, and what this anonymous spy, James Harper, was feeding them in an effort to get them to use him as a double agent. So those things came together in a way. So they were both, the US intelligence was both lucky and good, which I think you have to be both, right? You have to be both, because it's not clear they would have ever gotten Harper without either of those pieces of information. And at some point, and this is still a little bit hazy to me, it appears that by the mid-70s, the Bureau had recruited this Polish intelligence officer in Chicago. So somebody successfully recruited a Polish intelligence officer who then went back to Poland and was feeding them information on the Harper case, as well as other things, other very important cases. So that's part of it. I mean, I think that it is really hard to police an industry. In DC, people have clearances, right? So you have clearances, you can police information through the classification system. There are lots of people with clearances in the Valley, and there's lots of people working on military and defense projects, but there's also just lots of people who aren't. And folks in the Valley don't necessarily believe that what they do is of interest to Washington, let alone Moscow or Beijing or Tehran, right? But then there's that old apocryphal saying that's often attributed to Trotsky, right? Like, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Well, it's kind of like that with espionage in the Valley. Like, oh, you might think what you're doing has no interest to foreign states, but you don't get to decide that, right? And I think that that's just going to continually be an issue in the Valley. I think that there have been attempts over decades, some successful, some less so, in forging better connections between U.S. counterintelligence and the tech world. And in some cases, they've been very tight. And there's been good cooperation on a variety of, that's a conversation for a different hour. But like, post Snowden, things got really, really, really tense, because the culture of the Valley being like pretty left wing and pretty cosmopolitan, I think resented hearing about, but employees basically revolted and resented the idea that they were told they were working for a company where they could like play foosball. But there was like some secret, and they were like changing the world through better interconnectedness, through like, self-aggrandizing posts about all the fun places you've gone to and all the cool things you do. While in reality, like, their company was also working on projects that were, or they were participating in US government programs that were, seen as like mass surveillance. So there was a lot of pulling back after that. And I think that's always going to be a tension. There's also a lot of tensions around the Valley. Again, is very cosmopolitan. There's a lot of brilliant immigrants who come to the Valley and work there. And some of those, many of whom come from countries that don't necessarily have very good relationships with the US. There's a lot of Chinese nationals in the Valley. There's a lot of Russian nationals in the Valley. There's a lot of Iranian nationals in the Valley. There's a lot of Indian nationals in the Valley. And, particularly vis-a-vis China, I think there is a sense that the Bureau engages in ethnic profiling. And so there's, Bureau folks look at it differently, right? They have their own perspective. I'm given the perspective of the companies and the people in them. And I think that is a consistent tension there, right? Because, you have this discourse about, watch out, that like Chinese national might be a spy, and like, those are your coworkers and friends, right? And so again, these are persistent tensions that are going to go on for a very, very long time. And I spoke to security officials within some of these tech companies who talked about the difficulty in having conversations with their employees about this in a way that was sensitive to like the way that people viewed their work and each other, especially in this kind of cosmopolitan environment. So that's just another part of it, I think, that's going to always be a point of tension between the Bureau and the kind of the needs for higher awareness around intelligence issues and counterintelligence and security, and the just basic culture of the Bay Area and the Valley and the kind of multicultural and cosmopolitan way that it's developed.
So the weekend I ended up listening to this podcast, this was just this past weekend, a really interesting profile came out that I think is very relevant to kind of the themes that we've discussed today and the themes of the podcast. That's this in the New Yorker, a profile of Elon Musk talking about the role he's come to play in U.S. national security policy, particularly around Ukraine, but not exclusively limited to Ukraine, and some of the challenges of kind of managing him from the U.S. government's perspective, particularly based on interviews with certain senior U.S. government officials. And it's a fascinating profile to think about in the context of this story, because the story is an allegory, an extreme one, as you describe it, for some of the challenges of engaging with Silicon Valley in this national security space, where technology and national security are so intertwined, and you're dealing with an industry and a part of the country and a community that's values are different in certain substantial ways, not uniformly, but on average, embrace different perspectives than might be expected in Washington, D.C. or other places much closer to conventional government and policy. And Elon Musk I don't want to draw any sort of parallels between anything he's done and what Harper's done. That's not fair, I don't think. But he is certainly indicative of that mindset, I think, in a lot of people's minds, that kind of entrepreneurial instinct and value set, as are many other people in Silicon Valley. What advice do you take away from this story? What is the kind of closing data points and recommendations that you would give to the U.S. government policymakers to say, here's who you have to think about when you're engaging with this industry and with this sector, and vice versa, I suppose? Like, what are the big awareness points, as somebody who's thought about this in the context of one of the most problematic cases, that still resonates today, to say, you got to think about this when you enter into these sorts of relationships? And is there a way to really hedge and avoid the risk, or is it just part of what makes the relationship so inevitable and so appealing is the exact thing that creates these risks in the first place?
So I think, with the full disclosure that I haven't read the Farrow profile yet in the New Yorker of Musk, and I'm looking forward to it. I have a pretty decent understanding of the issues surrounding Musk's Starlink satellite system, and it's become critical in Ukraine, but it's privately owned, right? I mean, it's Elon Musk. So he can do whatever he wants with it. He can degrade the capabilities of the Ukrainian forces to use them, in certain areas if he deems fit. And I believe that there was some reporting in that piece that said, like, as soon as they crossed a certain line, all of a sudden there was a degradation in the quality of the Starlink systems. I'm not a policymaker, and I know this is a fraught terrain, the kind of regulation of big tech, and both political parties have their bones to pick for different reasons, although there seems to be some alignment on policy recommendations. I think sometimes government thinks it's the shark and the valley is the lamprey, and then it turns around and realizes, like, we're the lamprey, and the valley is the shark, and like we are being led by something that we thought we were in control of, and that was actually the force to be reckoned with. And I think that, there's been a discussion, it popped up a lot during the Trump years, although I think, Biden, in the Biden years, they managed to pass that China competitiveness bill, which is one of the few truly bipartisan achievements of the Biden years. And that was really an industrial policy bill. Like this idea that we have to guide industry in certain key sectors because they have inherent value for national security. And I think what the Harper case shows, and the Musk case shows, and the kind of broader discourse around the Valley and big tech shows, is that certain industries require regulation and guidance and a kind of mutual understanding of their evolution and growth. It's almost like how you force a bonsai. Like, you don't stop the bonsai from growing, but you let it grow, and you have it grow in a certain way upward and not outward. And so the kind of like guided growth of an industry and regulation go hand in hand, especially when there's so many critical ramifications for national security. But you have to do that while balancing U.S. values around free enterprise, free expression, like the stuff that kind of makes the engine of the Valley go, this idea that like you can be open, and you should be open. And this openness is what causes these incredible bursts of creativity that lead to these amazing breakthroughs that have made the Valley what it is. How you solve for X there, how you manage growth and you regulate well without over-regulating or somehow stymieing what makes the Valley special. And then also doing something that is closer to like a managed economy, which I don't think anybody wants, for all kinds of ideological reasons. I don't know how you do that, but I do think that, if I were like a counterintelligence professional and I wanted to have people like listen to this podcast, I'd be like, this is like the worst case scenario. And there are people like this out there. And we need to think through how to get people within those companies and in those environments, like aware of like, it has nothing to do with the color of your skin or your ethnic background. But like, if you know a James Harper out there or somebody who just seems like the rules just truly do not apply to them and that they're willing to do anything in the service of themselves, that person might be a problem, and those people exist in the Valley. They do. They definitely exist today. And as long as that culture exists here, you're going to have more James Harpers. And that would be the lesson I hope folks would impart from listening to this podcast.
Well, we will have to leave the conversation there. But Zach, thank you so much for joining us here today on the Lawfare podcast.
Thank you so much, Scott. Really appreciate it.
As promised, here is a preview of Spy Valley from episode 3 entitled Get As Much As You Can. In this clip, we hear about a fateful meeting between Harper, his conduit to the Soviet bloc Hugel, and their contact in Polish intelligence Sehojan that almost brings about an end to their conspiracy.
Meanwhile, Harper and Bill Hugel's relationship was starting to fray. Hugel clearly wanted to keep a close eye on Harper, and he wasn't about to be shut out of the deal with the Poles. Harper, soon after he returned to Silicon Valley from Europe, took to his diary again. Surprise. Hugel is back. He called about 9 a.m. and wanted to meet my place at 10:30. Bill was vague about why he returned. I think it was to keep an eye on my main deal. We discussed everything and agreed to meet his place next day for more detail. They all knew the next steps. The three of them, Harper, Hugel, and Sehojan, met again a few months later in Europe. This time in the notorious Cold War spy capital of Vienna, Austria. Harper landed in October 1979, and he met a favored companion upon his arrival.
Well, I found out that Louise was going to Europe herself and was going to be there when her boss was there on at a conference.
Harper wanted to keep Schuler's role hidden because he didn't want anyone to know who his source was for the missile documents. So the plan was, while Harper ran interference, Schuler would lay low to preserve her anonymity. Harper checked himself into the Intercontinental Hotel, right in the center of the city. Hugel, laser-focused on his cut, also arrived at the hotel. Sehojan, too. Hugel met Harper in his hotel room, just the two of them. And Harper took out the documents he planned to offer the Poles. Hugel didn't say a word. He turned up the volume on the radio and took out a handkerchief. He held the documents with the handkerchief in order to not leave any fingerprints. Hugel looked them over and agreed that their sale could be very lucrative. The next day, Harper, Hugel, and Sehojan met at a nearby apartment. Hugel was worried about electronic listening devices in their hotel rooms. Over scotch and champagne, Harper produced a master document, a table of contents of sorts. He described the other materials he'd brought, as well as some documents he had already copied back in Silicon Valley.
And I had not only the material that we had suggested in the first meeting, but I had a whole lot of other stuff. I don't know, it was about, maybe 3 or 4 inches of, maybe a couple of reams of 8.5 by 11 paper that was abstracts from classified material that I was getting from Louise, and I phonied it up. It looked good, I'll tell you.
Harper was feeling very good about the meeting. Maybe too good. Because he made a brash move. He showed Sihojin a pair of Schuller's sunglasses he had brought with him. And he told the Polish spy that a woman wearing those same sunglasses would soon stop by his hotel room to drop off the documents and collect the cash. Harper was having his source of the stolen files get dangerously close to the action.
We had a real interesting meeting there.
And here's when things went a bit sideways.
That's when Precision stiffed me on the original $15,000.
That's the original $15,000 that Sihojin had agreed to pay for the documents delivered to him at that first meeting in Warsaw months ago.
I was supposed to get paid at that time for something that I had given Procision in that first meeting.
And Harper was dead set on getting his share.
And Louise went to that room.
Sihojin was supposed to drop the money into Louise's handbag.
But he didn't do it.
Schuller returned to Harper's room empty-handed. Sihojin followed shortly after. And the men argued about money while Schuller hid in the bathroom.
He came back to our room and said, "Hey, there's nothing but child's play. We're not going to give you anything for them. There's nothing but child's play."
The Polish intelligence officer told Harper the documents were, quote, worthless as a cold cup of pee. Sihojin was saying, "We know you're trying to scam us. Not only are we not going to pay you for the documents you've brought on this trip to Vienna, we're not going to pay you the previously promised $15,000 either." Sihojin left Harper in his hotel room. The Silicon Valley engineer was seething. Harper rushed to find Hugel, who was drinking at the hotel bar. Sihojin had headed down there too. At the bar, Harper told Hugel the news. Sihojin wasn't going to pay them. And Hugel erupted at Sihojin, right in the middle of the crowded bar.
He and Hugel actually had a real loud, uncensored argument about what was going on. I remember Hugel saying something like, "You owe me," like that. And here, this place is a big hotel bar, the Intercontinental Hotel in Vienna. Yeah. That's the spy center of the world. You wouldn't have had to be a rocket scientist to figure out what was going on.
Even for Harper, as bold as he was, this was too much. He watched Hugel and Sihojin scream at each other over a cash payout for stolen secrets in a crowded hotel bar. So he immediately decided to lam it.
I went up to the room and I told Louise, I said, "Get our shit ready. We're getting out of here right now." And Louise and I went directly to the airport and we got the hell out of there.
There are a few possible reasons why Harper's deal with Sihojin went sour. Either Harper didn't provide what he'd actually promised to the Polish spy, so his documents just weren't of any great intelligence value to the Soviet bloc. Or Sihojin was engaging in an epic bluff, trying to falsely devalue the documents to keep Harper coming back, offering more information on the cheap. But in truth, it was a little bit of both. Sihojin was trying to lowball Harper. Though some of the missile-related documents Harper offered weren't sensitive, many were utterly explosive. A goldmine for Moscow spies. Sihojin wanted all those classified documents without paying Harper the one-time $1 million fee he'd demanded. Either way, after that blowout argument in the hotel bar in Vienna, things had spun out of control. The meeting also caused bad blood between Harper and Hugel, because, according to Harper, they had worked out a contingency plan. Hugel had promised to pay Harper back for the money he was owed, given the risk he'd taken, if the Poles somehow squirmed out of paying up.
He would underwrite it if that happened, and when it happened, he just begged off and didn't give me any money. I was kind of pissed at him because of that. I ended up spending a lot of my own money and getting very close to broke at that time.
The threads of trust between the three men were fraying even further. Eventually, after the meeting, Harper and Hugel spoke on the phone about their deal with Sihojin. Hugel asked Harper if Louise enjoyed her trip to Vienna. This was a problem. Even though he had sent her to collect the money at the hotel in Vienna, Harper had purposefully hidden Schuyler's identity and role in the scheme from Hugel and Sihojin. Harper believed Hugel's comment was an intimidation tactic, Hugel's way of saying that he knew the real source of Harper's missile documents. And if Hugel had this information, it could be all over for Harper. Hugel and Sihojin could cut out the middleman. Still, Harper was so broke that, back in Silicon Valley, he took Hugel out to lunch and asked him for a $2,500 loan. Hugel gave him $100 in cash. Next time, on Spy Valley, a desperate Harper doubles down on spying for the Soviet bloc and gets his big payday.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. Please be sure to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to check out Lawfare's other podcasts, including Rational Security, a casual, lighthearted chat about national security news that I co-host each week with my colleagues Quinta Jurecic and Alan Rosenstein. In addition, be sure to visit lawfaremedia.org for our extensive written coverage of national security law and policy issues, and consider becoming a material supporter of Lawfare at patreon.com/lawfare to gain access to an ad-free version of this and other Lawfare podcasts, among other perks. This podcast was edited by Jen Patchahal and produced by Jay Venables of Goat Rodeo. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thank you for listening.